1999 and 2004. On September 2008, Dr. Mbeki resigned as president of South Africa after being asked to do so by the ANC NEC. He is currently the chairperson of the AU High-Level Implementation Panel for Sudan and South Sudan, the chairperson of the African Union High Panel on the Security of the Horn of Africa, and the AU-UN High-Level Panel on illicit financial outflows from Africa. In addition, he is also the chairperson of the board of the South Center, a think tank of the countries of the Global South based in Geneva, Switzerland. Dr. Mbeki has previously facilitated peace negotiations in various African countries, including Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Burundi, Cote d'Ivoire, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Upon his retirement as the president of the Republic of South Africa, Dr. Mbeki set up the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, of which he is a patron, to pursue the ideals of Africa's Renaissance, and through which he undertakes various activities consistent with these ideals. He is currently the Chancellor of the University of South Africa. Your Excellency, welcome to this interview. To interview His Excellency are two distinguished African scholars, public intellectuals, notable figures. Professor Paul Selesa, one of the continent's preeminent scholar, is at the moment the Associate Provost and North Star Distinguished Professor at Case Western Reserve University, a leading American research center. His immediate past appointment was at the United States International University, Africa in Nairobi, Kenya, where he served as the Vice Chancellor and President and Professor of the Social Sciences and Humanities. It was a privilege for me to visit him when he was Vice Chancellor and to host a major conference that was very successful. And in that conference, he received the Thabo Mbeki Award, which we set up some years back. Congratulations again, Professor Selesa, for receiving the Mbeki Award. Prior to that, he held distinguished academic and administrative positions in Canada as Professor of History and College Principal at Trent University, Professor of African Studies and History, Center Director at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Professor of History and African American Studies and Social Sciences, Research Professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Thereafter, he served as a distinguished professor and department chair at the University of Illinois, Chicago, president professor and dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Loyola Marymount University. And it was also a privilege for me to visit him when he was dean at Loyola Marymount University. And thereafter, he served as the academic vice president at Quinnipiac University, where I served with him on the board of the African Diaspora Fellowship. We award grants to African-based in the diaspora to go to Africa to teach, organize seminars, and run workshops. Altogether, he has been at a dozen universities in 6 countries, on 3 continents and the Caribbean region. He received his bachelor's degree with distinction at the University of Malawi, master's at the University of London, and PhD at Dalhousie University. Forgive me, Mr. President, that the bio of those who are interviewing you are longer than that of you. In the early 2000s, Selesa worked as a consultant for the Ford and Mercator Foundations, and he has published more than 400 journals. Please join me in welcoming Professor Selesa. Next to interview the president is Naledi Mvuyelwa, a young, brilliant, talented African, a seasoned broadcaster of news and current affairs, communication expert, media trainer. She's been working for 17 years. She's appeared on current affairs host on SABC News International. She's been an anchor on ETV and Sport. She leads discussion on various platforms. Her on-screen career has seen her host prime television shows such as Love Lives, Make Your Move, and she's very well known in South Africa. And she's appeared on the platform Youth Expression on SABC News International, Primetime Radio on SAFM, and recently, she's the anchor of E-Media Holdings for both ETV. She's a facilitator of dialogues and panels, and Naledi has led discussions for the European Commission's high-level discussion gender action, the one campaign, the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us. President Mbeki celebrated his 80th birthday yesterday, and it's my pleasure to invite Moloku Kosiochukwu Pamela to sing a happy birthday song for the president. Moloko, please.
It's indeed an honor to wish Mr. President happy birthday, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, happy birthday. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you very much. She's a student of Babcock University in Nigeria. Thank you very much. Let's now begin the interview with the first question from the distinguished journalist, Naledi.
Well, good evening, good day to everyone, considering that we all are in different parts of the world. My name is Naledi Mvuyelwa. I will be part of one of the moderators of this discussion. Mr. President, firstly, thank you so much for giving us your time, and a happy belated birthday to you. Happy Father's Day to you as well. In fact, it is Professor Zeleza who will be asking the first question, because, you know, we say quite often, ladies first, but I like to say that because we're in Africa, can the men lead in case there's a lion outside the hut? So Professor Zeleza, could you kick things off for us, please?
Thank you, Naledi, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you attending this special interview with President Thabo Mbeki as he celebrates his 80th birthday. Mr. President, happy birthday. 10 years ago, I had the privilege to attend your 70th birthday at your home in Johannesburg, and it is an honor to meet you virtually 10 years later on this very special occasion. Mr. President, you're the son of parents who were intellectuals and lifelong activists. What was your upbringing like? How did it make you to become the person, politician, and public intellectual that you became?
I don't think he's hearing us. He's not been hearing us.
Mr. President, can you hear us?
No, I don't think so.
And he's muted, I think.
I don't think he's muted. It's not hearing us.
Can somebody who is working with us in the place where he is facilitate? Mr. President, can you hear us? Ladies and gentlemen, let's just
Hold on, Paul. Hold on, Paul. Let's give them
give
time.
us some time to sort that out.
Hello, we've been talking. You can't hear us?
It's faint.
Now we can hear you, sir. Now we can hear you, Mr. President.
Yeah, but your voice is coming across to me very faint.
It's not from our hand. It's from your. It's from your hand.
Yes, you are quite correct. Now I can hear you very loud indeed.
So we did not know that you have not been listening to all the introduction. We even sang a birthday song to you. But
yes,
I noticed.
We missed your introduction, most of it.
Okay, now, okay, Paul, please, Paul, can you ask your question now, sir? Paul.
Yes, Mr. President, once again, happy birthday. We're very delighted that you are spending this very special day with us, with the African community on the continent, in the diaspora, and of course, friends of the continent. Mr. President, I wanted to begin by asking you to share with us your experiences growing up. You're the son of parents who were intellectuals and lifelong activists. So we would like to know what your upbringing was like. How did that make you become the person, the politician, and the public intellectual that you became?
Well, then, thanks for the good wishes. As you said, Professor Zeleza, my parents were activists, intellectuals, and all that. As a result of which, there were a lot of books. There were many books at home as we grew up. So we picked up the habit of reading quite early. And of course, as you can imagine, these were books which were way above our heads, but we read them nevertheless. But in a sense, that taught us the need to inquire, to try to gain more knowledge, to gain more understanding of reality, in a sense, to be questioning and seeking knowledge, seeking with something. My mother was also a teacher. And so we started learning. She taught us before we were formally admitted to school. So I was a year and a half early in terms of my admission to primary school, earlier than the official age. it's because she taught us at school. But as she taught us at home, we engaged with her in a lot of conversation. So I suppose we've therefore grew up in circumstances where learning, debating matters, getting to know something, that became very much part of our upbringing. And because of the parentage, also you'd have older people posing questions to us, which in a sense we had to answer, but in fact, I think the questions were a bit too old for us. For instance, I went to some school in the Transkei, in a town called Butterworth, and the headman, the traditional leader in charge of the area, once asked me to come to see him. I went to see him. I was about 11, 12. And at that time, the apartheid regime had decided that there must be culling of stock in the Transkei, among other measures, because there was not enough land. And then so you are getting corrosion because of particular mismanagement of land under situations where the population was too big. And so this headman asked me, wanted to know my opinions as to whether we should accept these government-imposed programs or not, which had to do with cattle culling and all of that. And as I said, I must have been about 11 or 12. And so we engaged in serious discussion about this. And of course, I was very much opposed to the cattle culling. But what I'm trying to say to you, Professor Zaleza, is that, in a sense, that's how we grew up, in a situation of real engagement with issues, engagement with ideas, and engagement with people from quite an early age.
And of course, you were a very key member of the African National Congress. During the protracted national liberation struggle from apartheid, and while planning for the country's post-apartheid future, what lessons did the ANC learn from the liberation struggles and the challenges faced by the post-independence governments in the rest of Africa in building what is often called a democratic developmental state?
Well, I think one of the things that really was very important in terms of our own understanding of what we would face in South Africa was that the matter of building these new societies coming out of colonial oppression, apartheid oppression, that it really would be, it's an important challenge. It's not easy. There are no quick fixes. And certainly it's important that those who are governing should maintain regular contact with the masses of the people and communicate to them honestly about the challenges, because of the levels of expectation by the people. It's always important, we thought, that then governments need to communicate to people regularly to say that we don't have a university today, but we'll have one tomorrow, and so on. That's one of the things that I think we got to understand. The other one was that there was no set way in which to construct your democracy. For instance, you recall at some point there was a lot of debate about the matter about one-party states. We tried to follow that debate, but I must say fundamentally, of course, one of the things we understood was that in many, many ways, South Africa was very different from many other African countries. For instance, just to take one element, we had and we still have a very large settler population in millions. As you remember, the only other country which on the continent which had that kind of size of settler population was Algeria, who then left, the French left. at the independence of Algeria. The South Africans didn't. So I'm saying there's one peculiar feature about South Africa. And therefore we knew that in many respects, the challenges we would face in South Africa would in some respects be different from the challenges faced by our other brothers and sisters on the rest of the continent because of the nature of the society that had been created during the colonial and apartheid days. But certainly these matters about, one has got to be patient about the development processes. One is to make sure that the masses of the people are engaged in that. Otherwise they turn their backs and become hostile because you are not delivering things, progress and all of that, reduction of poverty and so on. But certainly that then there's a political challenge about what kind of democratic society do you construct so that it becomes relevant to what you have to do and indeed continues to enjoy the support of the people.
Thank you very much. I will now ask my colleague, Naledi, to proceed. You're muted.
There we go. Professor Zeleza, thank you so much for opening the conversation up. President.
You're muted again, sorry.
Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay. I'll start again. President, thank you so much for giving us your time, firstly. And Prof. Zeleza, Prof. Falola, this is for me a very important evening, specifically because I'm 34 years old living in South Africa. We know that one of the things young South Africans want is to have the bigger conversations with some of the leaders that we hold as very esteemed. So the president giving us this time is no small thing, certainly not to the youth of our country. And so what you'll find with me, President, is that I'm going to emote a little bit through our discussion and I'm going to bring it back home. But I said earlier, blessings to you as you celebrate your 80th, President, and happy Father's Day as well. I know that I listened to the radio and I heard a few messages of happy Father's Day to you on the national radio today as well. As you sit at the age of 80, I imagine, obviously, there's a lot of reflective work that you do. And I think anyone who thinks about what they're going to be doing when they turn 80 thinks about whether or not they're going to reflect positively and feel confident as they reflect. When you sit by yourself, President, and you reflect on your 80 years of life, what is it that you personally are most proud of?
Well, well, first of all, now let me say that I don't normally, I haven't done it anyway. Sit and reflected on so many years, of 8 years or whatever. What would we be proud of? I mean, we'd be proud of liberation. That we're engaged in a struggle to defeat the apartheid regime, to defeat the apartheid system, and that struggle succeeded. I think that's a very good, happy achievement for many of us. South Africa also, after its liberation, tried to make its contribution to this very, very important historical task of the development of the African continent. We were aware because of the struggle against apartheid. And the apartheid system was very, very, very offensive to all Africans on the continent, Africans in the diaspora. And therefore, there was everybody's engagement with the struggle for the liberation of South Africa. And necessarily, therefore, as a consequence of that, many expectations that once South Africa is free, then it will create space for other things to happen, which would help to address the challenges, as I say, of the Africans on the continent and the diaspora. that's why I'm saying, I think we could be happy as South Africans that at a certain point, for a certain period of time anyway, we tried to do what we could to make our own little contribution to responding to this challenge of development in Africa and so on. I think that's an achievement. Unfortunately, in later years up to now, that engagement, which is task of an African Renaissance, has weakened. That's something we've got to address as South Africans. That's something we have to address. But I'm saying these other achievements are very important achievements. And I would say lastly, that there was also a period when the rest of the world treated the continent with some respect, the African continent. That is when, for instance, we had an agreement with what was the G8 on what became the G8 Africa Action Plan. We'd worked with them on that and said to them, they must base their own engagement with the African continent on Africa's own plans for development. They mustn't come and impose their own desires, but engage the African continent in a particular way, and they agreed. And I think it was a particular moment, it's past, and we must go back there, when at least the rest of the world was listening to what the Africans are saying about their own continent. I think those were important achievements, my lady.
Yeah, I can tell you, Mr. President, that in my generation, certainly, and we were those that remember 1994, and we were, the first children of the democracy. So I think that work is still very much visible in our generation, and there's the responsibility that some of us have then to continue it with those that came after us. And that brings me then to my second question, which is about really handing over the baton, if you will. Of recent years, and I think over the past 10 to 15 years, the conversation has gotten louder and louder in South Africa about whether or not we are handing the baton over to younger leaders, if we are preparing them for the leadership of our country and our continent. And I wonder if perhaps we don't see enough of that, because we've forgotten what that handing over of the baton actually looks like. And so, but I'm going to ask you, President, if you can perhaps go back to moments, particular poignant moments that for you really felt like a responsibility was being given to you to take over, from, say, OR, from Utatu Mandela. What were those moments that were the awakening of, wow, I am next and I need to prepare myself for the responsibility that I already have, but what's still coming?
Well, I think my generation, we were very fortunate in that we joined the ANC, the African National Congress, at a young age. For instance, when I joined the ANC Youth League, I was 13 and a half years old.
Sure.
And so from then onwards, we were engaged with these issues about the struggle and the defeat of apartheid and so on. What are the policies and all that, and so on. The value systems of the ANC and all of that. So we grow up in the movement. And so at school, I joined the African National Youth League at school. As I was saying, at 13 and a half years old. I left Lovedale, that high school where we were. It was a boarding school. I left it 4 years later. But by that time, the members of the Youth League at Lovedale had elected me to be to the branch executive committee. So we're part of the leadership of the Youth League at school in those years, 14, 15, 16. So it was not a handing over from somebody. It was not part of the natural process of growing up in the Youth League. That then you get elected. After some time, they say, no, this one is good enough to become member of the executive committee. And generally, that would be true throughout our lives. That then at a later stage, much later, you would given responsibilities like, okay, can you go and be the ANC representative in Nigeria or somewhere? But it's not like a promotion or a handing over or anything like that. Or in my case, 1975, I'm told I've been co-opted onto the National Executive Committee of the ANC. This would be because I'd been working in the ANC for so many years. Even after I left university, got involved in ANC work full time. And so the rest of the leadership watching, a vacancy creates, it opens up, they say, no, but this one would be fit to take this responsibility. You had a certain point when the group of ANC leaders who differed with ANC policy, in the end, they left the organization. They were called the Gang of Eight. They left the organization. They were older than us, very much our leaders. But their departure, that's 8 leading members, created many challenges for the leadership of the ANC because then there were certain tasks that they had to be done, the ones that had been carrying out. So we were the next group of people who were then approached by the leadership to say, in the light of the fact that these other comrades have left, now there are these vacancies in terms of what needs to be done, you people must come. We resisted that because we're saying, look, we're still too young. Those posts are too senior for us, but there was nobody else, and the leadership insisted. Again, it was not a handing over thing. It's a matter of your progression. It's a progression through the ranks of the movement, and therefore you will naturally, in a sense, assume different positions. Even if you take the case of my succeeding Nelson Mandela, I knew Nelson Mandela personally, worked with him when I was still 18, 19 years old. He used to call me to his house, ANC's band then, when I was 19, 20, and we engaged in conversation. What I didn't know was that he would ask me to come home, come and let's have lunch. And so we'd have lunch. What I didn't know was that the reason he was doing that was to test with me certain matters that they had discussed in the leadership of the ANC underground, as to see how would the youth respond to these positions. He wouldn't put it like that, but in fact, that's what he was doing. So, so by the time he is president of the Republic, I'm his deputy. You see, it's not it's a continuing process.
Right.
It's a continuing process, so there's no sense of there's a baton being handed over. We're all part of one struggle. It's a systemic process, and you're part of it. And therefore, this, I should say, this thing, Naledi, what becomes important here, when you're raising this matter about succession, generations, and all that, what's very, very important, I think, about the involvement of young people in terms of this political leadership, certainly, is that the young people themselves should have very strong youth organizations. To be very active, for instance, today, very active in terms of addressing these challenges of poverty, unemployment, bad governance, bad politics, to be part of that. And that's how they become, in the end, not just leaders of the youth, but leaders of the nation as a whole. So there's a certain level of preparation in that sense, which is required, and I'm saying critical to that preparation we need an organized and conscious active youth. That's very, very important to address the matter about youth development and youth succession.
Yeah. President, thank you for that. I think what I'm taking out of that is quality leadership is about consistency and not necessarily progression. But we'll talk some more. Let me bring Professor Zeleza back in.
Thank you. I want to show our appreciation to various representatives of the African Union who have joined us. We have 13 heads of state who have joined us on a separate link that we set up for them. We are very grateful. This is being watched live in 31 countries, television stations and radio stations. At the end of the interview, we may be up to over 20 million who are watching this program. We thank all of you for doing this. Professor Zeleza, please. Professor, we can't hear you, please. Professor Zeleza. Unmute, please. Unmute.
Yes, I was muted. Sorry for that. Mr. President, as you rightly said, the struggle for South Africa animated the entire Pan-African world on the continent, in the diaspora. And I remember as a student and later on as a young academic, when I was in Jamaica, talking a lot and engaging a lot of groups about the struggle against apartheid, receiving delegations from the ANC, SWAPO, and so on and so forth. And when, of course, the change took place in 1994, all of us were electrified by the changes. There were great expectations and so on. The first 5 years, 1994 to 1999, were, of course, very, very crucial in laying the groundwork for a social democratic state and society in South Africa. What, in your view, were some of the key challenges during those first 5 years when you served as Deputy President under President Mandela in establishing the basis for the post-apartheid dispensation?
Well, Professor Zeleza, the major challenge, of course, is this level of expectation as a result of the liberation was within South Africa and, as you say, throughout the Pan-African world. So the pressure for change for the masses of our people here to say, this was apartheid, we have now moved into a new world, was very important. But of course, there are various challenges. One of them was, I mentioned earlier, that one of the features about South Africa is that what had been the original settler population in millions of people, it did not leave. These were South Africans. Now, it's one consequence of that was that there was always a fear among us that there would be among those white people, people who would not have been happy about the ending of the apartheid system, that now you have a black government in place. And therefore, these are people who would then plan to do counter-revolutionary things, who would still want to defeat this change. And we thought then that the most likely way that they would try to do that is the use of violence, assassination of our leaders, disruption of the infrastructure, blowing up railway lines, things like that. And therefore, that required a particular kind of political approach to avoid the consequence of that kind. And that's why you would find, for instance, that President Mandela, he's got a reputation as a person of reconciliation, which is true, but that was ANC policy. It was not a Mandela policy. But we had to pay particular attention to that matter in order to stop this kind of consequence I'm talking about, of these counter-revolutionary forces intervening in order to produce negative results. that had another impact, which was that it was necessary to generate more resources from within the South African population in order to invest in really to look for some quick results with regard to some things, whether it's supply of clean water or free access to health and so on. But we hesitate. There was a discussion, for instance, about the imposition of a wealth tax, 1, 2, 3 year term for 3 years or something, a wealth tax to generate, what was called a reconstruction fund. But basically that would mean this white population, which is where the wealth was, would then have to pay that tax. Now we hesitated to do that, again, because of this fear, this concern that we didn't want to be faced with a counter-revolution, and therefore had to handle this matter in a particular way. You have an example which was somewhat painful. When we took over, the apartheid regime had put in a child support grant system to support children of poor families, but the whites and the Indians, colors, but not the black population. So it was discriminatory. So we then decided it's a good idea to have a child support grant. And it's necessary that it should affect all South African people, all South Africans together without discrimination. And therefore we'll continue with the child support grant, but spread it out to cover the black population. But it was also clear then that if we suddenly opened it up to all of the black people at the same rates as were being paid then it would bankrupt the state. So it was clear that we had to bring it in gradually. So effectively what happened was, you then had this minority population, which used to receive these high grants, to continue, and the African population, which had been excluded, entered from below, as it were, with the smaller grants. And then you keep growing that grant for the black people, which means you had to bring it down for the other ones, until in the end, they had the same grants. So for a number of years, in a sense, we maintained a discriminatory system with regard to the child grants. But it was because we're handling a situation in which, as I was saying, unlike the rest of Africa, we still had within South Africa a big white settler population, which had been accustomed to being the dominant. And we're very careful that we don't do anything that would open the space for them to launch a counter-revolutionary offensive. I'm just, Professor Zeleza, trying to describe a particular situation that affected particularly the 5 years from 1994 to 99.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also during this period, it's a moment globally during which the neoliberal Washington consensus is reigning supreme. To what extent was that, an important factor in the kind of policy discourses you were having? And certainly during your own presidency, you introduced a number of economic policy reforms, including the growth, employment, and redistribution program. How would you assess the impact of these reform programs that started, of course, under the Mandela administration and continued under your administration?
Yes, you are quite right, Professor Zeleza, about this, the dominance of neoliberal perspective, the Washington consensus and so on at that time. It was not, I don't think the the ideology, the philosophy, whatever you want to call it, had a particular impact on us. We had particular problems here. For instance, as the apartheid regime was approaching its exit, it increased the public debt because they were trying to buy the allegiance of a population that was rebelling against them. So we're getting into a situation where we would, if we continued with the structure of the budget that we inherited, if we continued with that, you would, soon enough, you'd really be paying, demanding tax returns from people in order to pay the money lenders. So the matter of the national debt had to be dealt with. You couldn't continue with raising those levels of public debt. And indeed, the very first program we decided on, it was called the Reconstruction and Development Program. It raised that question and said, we have not had time to discuss these macroeconomic issues about levels of debt and levels of rate of exchange and all of that. And therefore the government will have to attend to this matter. So this was a particular challenge. What do we do about this level of debt? Clearly it had to come down. We have to generate more resources, not to pay money lenders, but in order to invest in the country, in the economy, in development and all of that. So in the end, we had to, as I say, we had to manage the South African economy in a particular way. We inherited an economy with a particular structure. One of the features was this very high and increasing public debt. Therefore, budgetary changes had to be made and so on. But in the end, what happened was, at a certain period, up to maybe 2008, 2010, when in fact South Africa then achieved these relatively high rates of growth, like 5% growth rates, new numbers of people employed, the rate of level of unemployment did not decrease. It's because the rate of creation of new jobs was not keeping pace with the increase in the population. But in fact, the size of the working population increased quite dramatically. The economy grew, expanded, and all that. And that is why even we're able to sustain high levels of spending in terms of social benefits, pensions, and all of that. Because the economy was growing and generating the kind of wealth that was necessary to address things like that. That process was effectively disrupted by the financial economic crisis that started with the collapse of the US banks, 2007, 2008. Now that had a very, very negative impact. Yeah, and since then, except for splatters here and there, the South African economy really has never recovered from that. But before that, it actually had been growing up quite nicely, developing. Plus a very important element, Professor Zaleza here, what people talk about business confidence. I come back to what I was raising earlier. Part of the challenge we had was that you then have this big capitalist class, largely white, which in fact for many, many years, and I don't think we've overcome this problem, had no confidence in the future of South Africa. The transition that occurred in '94, which many people call the miracle, a view of many of those capitalists was that this story is too good to be true. Because in their view, they say, look at the rest of what's happened in the rest of the continent of Africa. Sooner or later, there will be a crisis. So a reluctance to invest, maintenance of high rates of liquidity, so that if they have to run away, they run away with the money, because you can't run away with the factory. So I'm saying at a certain period, even these capitalists began to grow a certain level of confidence in the economy, in the future of the country, which is why then you would then get more higher rates of investment and then so on. That situation, I think, has reversed to some extent now because of what has happened in the country. But these are the responses that we had to make in order to ensure that the economy grows, creates more wealth. We deal with questions of extreme poverty, issues of inequality, until the growth process in the economy was disrupted.
Yeah, thank you for that. It underscores the complex interplay of domestic and global forces. In this case, as you said, you know, the country was making progress, and the Great Recession, you know, puts a spanner into the works. And of course, it also generates other internal dynamics that complicate the situation. Let me ask Naledi to continue the conversation. You're muted, Naledi.
I just have to wait for the host to unmute me. This is what happens when we have that little delay in the switchover. Thank you, Professor Zeleza. Like I said, President, I'm always going to try and bring it back home, because I know that many are watching and are very keen to hear some of their own questions here at home, which are a little bit more impacting us right now. The issue of constitutionality has become a very interesting conversation in South Africa, and just understanding our constitution. I remember when I was growing up, you know, in the mid-90s, that little book was in so many homes. The access to the constitution was there, and we could page through it in our homes. And I haven't seen that in the country in a very long time. And for the first time, I've had people say to me, well, don't talk to me about this constitution of yours, you know? And I go back to 1996, when you delivered that unforgettable I'm an African speech. It was on the 8th of May in 1996. And it was essentially on the day that we saw the adoption of the RSA Constitution Bill. And then the world spoke about this constitution, and it was lauded. How do you say to a 30-year-old today why that constitution was so lauded in those days?
I think it's because, you know, after all of these years, 300 years, 350 years of colonialism and apartheid, some people thought, obviously, this Black population, come liberation, in a sense, it's got to engage in some revenge. That, you know, the notion of South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. Some people would say, no, but that's a bit of a betrayal. How can this belong to black and white when the whites have been oppressors for so many centuries? So I'm saying when the Constitution came out as it did, clearly people then said, but now it's no longer a political speech that is made at a rally. This is a fundamental law of the Republic, the Constitution. So everything that happens in terms of the law and the practice and so on is based on what is contained in this Constitution. And that Constitution was indeed saying, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that even the government, the government popularly elected with overwhelming majority, it did not have a free hand to do as it wishes, because it was governed by what is in this Constitution. So that Constitution set limits on what governments can do. So addressing some value systems, perspectives which were agreed nationally as the constitution was developed and then adopted, that whatever government you choose, it will work within the framework of this constitution.
Mm.
So it was the ANC itself, which of course dominated the dominant political party, in a sense was imposing restrictions on itself, not agreeing that there should be a parliamentary sovereignty, but let's have a constitutional democracy. I think these are some of the things that people who had been skeptical, about our capacity as Africans, really to produce the kind of state we're talking about, a non-racial state, a non-sexist state, one that addresses imbalances of the past, and all of that. I think some people who had maybe thought that as Africans, we're not really capable of that kind of sophistication. When it came, then it itself became a part of the conveyance of the message of a miracle. But I think in terms of ourselves in the struggle, these ideas we had grown up with in the struggle, they didn't come because we're now facing a Konyi, had to negotiate a new constitution. It's how we're brought up in the ANC for many, many decades. But as I say, to many people, it would come as a surprise. And therefore, when it comes, it becomes a moment of great celebration because it's something that some people did not expect.
Mm. That's very interesting. I've never thought about it like that, that it was the sophistication of the document from people that didn't expect that we could produce such. I want to go back to the 8th of May in 1996 in that poem. I think now we call it a poem. I'm an African. And I want to read an extract from it, President, if you'll allow me. In there, you say, I have seen the destruction of all sense of self-esteem, the consequent striving to be what one is not, simply to acquire some of the benefits which those who had improved themselves as masters had ensured that they enjoy. And when I read that line, what stood out for me was the term self-esteem. And it goes so deep, right? And I wonder if self-esteem adds to some of the issues that we've seen around corruption, and how do you link those two ideas together, President?
No, you see, as you know, Naledi, the colonial system, in the settler colonialism in South Africa, leading to apartheid, one of its very destructive elements was the destruction of the sense of identity of the African people. So it sought to, that system, it sought to create a Black person of a particular kind who would be subservient and do the dictates of the white masters and all of that. And in order to achieve that, you had to lose your own sense of identity, your own sense of pride in yourself, a sense of culture, language, everything. That's why they were, we would be given names. My name is Thabo, but the white people would call me Jim. So I become Jim to everybody. So that's where the self-esteem disappears as a part of a systematic process to produce a subservient population. And clearly, liberation must mean a very, very important element of the recovery of that sense of self-esteem, so that you have a value system as a human being. I'm guided by a certain value system which says, do this, don't do the other. But if you lose that sense of identity, you lose that capacity to be bound by certain value systems. And so that self-esteem is a rejection, the recovery of the self-esteem is a rejection, it's a combat. To reject, to defeat the consequences, the legacy of the colonial oppression.
Yeah, thank you for that, President. Prof. Seleza?
Thank you, Naledi, and thank you, President Mbeki, for elaborating on this very important question of self-esteem and the need to recover the agency that comes with self-esteem. At the end of the 1990s, beginning of the 2000s, the continent was engulfed in very complicated dynamics. On the one hand, a lot of conflicts, culminating in what some people regard as Africa's First World War over the Congo. On the other, the struggles for the second independence and the spread of democratic regimes. South Africa was of course not in a state of war by this time, but it shared some of the challenges that the continent was facing. One of those challenges was, of course, the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And there was also continued violence, including gender-based violence and growing xenophobia. How did your government address these challenges?
Professor Seleza, these are very important major questions. I don't know if we'll have enough time to address all of them effectively, but let me try. Take the matter about HIV and AIDS. The way the thing is communicated to us here in South Africa, and I suppose right throughout our continent, even in the diaspora, was that here is a very deadly disease, which is really going to decimate the population. There's no cure for it and all of that, but very, very deadly. So sitting as part of the South African government, we then say, look, therefore this matter is very important. It's necessary that as government, we respond to it very properly in a manner that helps us to escape this deadly outcome that is predicted. So the first thing we've got to do is to understand it. So indeed, we're not mere, for instance, I'm not a medical scientist and so on, but we're to do our best to understand this because of its gravity, of its importance. Now, Professor Seleza, I'm saying that I'm sure we won't have enough time to discuss matters like this because, as you know, we then say, what does AIDS mean? This is an acronym. It's acquired immune deficiency syndrome. That's what the medical scientists have called it, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. So in our discussions, we say, okay, in which case this matter about immune deficiency is important to this disease, as it was called, immune deficiency. Now, what is it that causes immune deficiency? Which relates to the A, the acquired part. Because some immune deficiency, if you look at the medical textbooks, is genetic. It comes from your parents, succession, and so on. But some of it is acquired immune deficiency. So we looked at that matter, and then you'll see in the medical textbooks, it will say it can be acquired from malnutrition. Sustained malnutrition over a period of time will produce immune deficiency. Or if you have syphilis, sexually transmitted diseases, you have syphilis, for instance, which is not properly treated. It's treated and the symptoms disappear, but actually whatever caused it is still there. That will cause, in the end, immune deficiency. So there are a number of things that can cause immune deficiency. So therefore, we as South Africans must find a way making sure that the health system, public health system that is, addresses those causes of immune deficiency. And then there's a matter of the virus, HIV. Reading all of this literature, that this virus, it must be one of the causes of this immune deficiency. So also you need to deal with it because it's part of the cause of AIDS. Now we come to the last letter S of AIDS. And popularly, people would say there is this disease. There's a disease called AIDS. It's not a correct expression, obviously, because acquired this thing, AIDS, that S stands for a syndrome. Now, a syndrome is a group of diseases. So you can't say AIDS is a disease. Medical science said this is a syndrome. It's a group of diseases which would include TB, which would include certain types of pneumonia, which would include whatever. So it's a group of diseases in the syndrome. So we've got to find ways of interacting with whatever it is that causes this immune deficiency, so that once you strengthen it, then you don't have a syndrome. Because these diseases like TB, they've got their known causes. Their known causes, they're very curable. Whereas the HIV, the virus, up to today, there's no vaccine that has been produced to deal with the virus. So you see what I'm trying to say, Professor Zeleza. Now we can go into, so we tried that as the South African government to say, look, let's have a health system that deals with this thing comprehensively, not just with antiretrovirals, but you need other medical interventions to do this. Of course, that then causes a controversy with people saying, we're saying HIV does not cause AIDS. We've never said that, but we've said that, you see, you cannot say, there's no medical science which says immune deficiency only arises because of one virus. So the health system has got to respond to it in a particular way, in a systematic way, in an overall way. Or you take the matter that you are raising, Professor Zeleza, this xenophobia. You see, I've been insisting all the time and continue to do so, that the Black population in South Africa is not xenophobic. You see, part of the reason is because since the 19th century, because of mining in South Africa, you've had people coming from as far as Malawi and Angola and so on, who are coming to work in South Africa. And these Black communities, they live together. They go to work together. There's no, since the 19th century. So then if you look specifically at these instances of xenophobia, you can see they are systematically organized. It's not the masses of the people who suddenly decide we don't like these other Africans. Take, for instance, the first instance of this, which was in 2008. That was a planned intervention. It had to do with the elections that were taking place in Zimbabwe. People wanted to drive as many of the Zimbabweans from South Africa, out of South Africa, back to Zimbabwe to go and vote. And those particular groups of people wanted these to go and vote against President Mugabe and ZANU-PF. Intelligence worked on this thing and identified even the persons who organized this thing and systematically what was done and all that. Now you would find that in many of these instances, it's South African traders who will say, away with these foreigners. And the reason they say it is because they find that they can't outcompete, or they find themselves outcompeted by these other business people. And then they start the rebellion, and they won't say, I want them to go because I'm running out of customers. They will say, because they are taking our jobs and this and that and the other. Now I'm saying, look at every single instance, Professor Zelez, of where you've had this phenomenon. Every single one. Since 2000, you will see that it's organized by various people. Of course, it then produces these xenophobic attacks. But I'm saying it doesn't come from a spontaneous reaction of the masses of the people here. It doesn't. It's certain interest groups that will drive this kind of thing. Even in terms of political interventions. People who don't want this democratic experiment in South Africa to succeed. I was talking earlier about the fear of counter-revolution that we entertained. I'm saying even those people who don't want this democracy to succeed, this is one of the instruments they use in order to generate instability. Let's say these fellow Africans are taking our jobs. It's systematic, it's organized. So you won't find it. There are lots of migrants from Asia, here from China, from Bangladesh, from Pakistan. And you never have hear of any instance of a response by this xenophobic population against them. It's because it won't be there unless somebody organizes it in terms of serving particular interests. So you see, Professor Zelez, I'm saying there were various responses to these things, which are very specific. But in many instances, I don't think we as South Africans, I don't think we do enough work, even among ourselves, to understand the phenomenon in order to be able to explain it even to ourselves. But there will be many of these issues, which again, as I was saying, we probably would not have enough time to debate.
Thank you for the elaborate responses. I agree, these are big issues that require more time. You said earlier that there was a moment during your leadership and President Mandela's leadership that South Africa, had a reputation that translated into being taken seriously in the global arena, in the G8, for example, as well as the G20. And you sort of hinted that things are no longer the same. How do you assess the current state of South Africa? Where do you think the country is headed? And how can it be steered to the future envisioned in the liberation struggle?
Well, first of all, to Professor Zelez, I was talking about not South Africa being listened to by the G8. I was talking about the continent, but Africa. But we're coming back to the matter that the specific question you are raising. Part of the history, let me talk about the history of the ANC post-liberation. Part of what has happened here is that the ANC attracted into its ranks people who were not in the least interested or supportive of the policies, the ideas, the values, and so on of the ANC, but saw the ANC as a stepladder. You join the ANC, that will give you access to state power, which will give you access to stealing public funds. So this problem was identified by the ANC leadership quite early. In fact, already in 1994, to say we are inheriting a member who's a member only because they carry a membership card, but in terms of their understanding, their convictions and so on, are not ANC. We were never able to deal with this problem over the years. And the reason we're not able to deal with it is because it's impossible to tell. This person who comes and says, I'm applying to be a member. I support the ANC policies. I'm prepared to swear the oath of loyalty and all of that. And I have the money to buy a membership card. You can examine me about my commitment. And as you can see, I'm busy in my, wherever I live, trying to do something to help the people. I'm saying there's no way of stopping this person from becoming a member. You will only discover later from their behavior that, sure, this is what they said, they support policies and all that, but in reality, they were after something else. The reality in the end, Professor Zeleza, of all of this, is that you then get a considerable number of people who are members of the ANC, which is the governing party, who are driven by motives other than those of a liberation movement. Hence, you'll get instances of corruption. At one of the conferences, for instance, Nelson Mandela was saying, we find that there are divisions in the organization and people are quarreling against one another, splits and so on. When you investigate the matter, you find that they are not being divided about policy, about philosophy, about anything. All it's about is access to positions of power in order to abuse those positions. That's what the scramble is about. So that has affected the ANC. And because it's been the governing party nationally since 1994, it then produces a particular impact on the country. And my view is that we are not going to be able to help South Africa to get out of these major challenges of corruption, of bad governance, of widespread criminality, which basically really amounts to a disrespect for the law. We are not going to be able to overcome these challenges until we sort out this governing party, which is a dominant political formation in South Africa, the ANC. Fortunately, at this last national conference in 2017, the ANC itself said so. Said we must go through a process of renewal, otherwise the ANC will cease to exist. That was a very correct decision of conference. This critical challenge of renewal. Unfortunately, it's not been done. The leadership that emerged from that conference has not engaged that process of renewal. The conference actually said the National Executive Committee itself must attend to this matter. And up to date, it hasn't done so. So the matter is still under discussion. So what I'm saying, Professor Zeleza, is that, in my view, the critical matter here is to sort out the ANC as its dominant political formation, as there has been the governing party now for what, 28 years. Of course, if it collapsed, because of its own misdeeds in 2 years or whenever people are talking about, then we'll have to deal with a different situation. But as of now, it's a responsibility of the leaders and members of the governing party to make sure that they rescue it from what it is, so that it becomes the ANC that gave so much hope to people on Liberation Day. Because over its years, over its decades, it had proved its worth as a leader and representative of our people. It has to go through a process of renewal. There is resistance to that from within, but it has to happen.
And perhaps it also underscores what is fairly common challenge of transition from liberation movements to governing parties in a post-colonial moment or post-colonial order. Naledi?
Yes, before Naledi comes in, we want to give a song and also read a poem in honor of the president. Please, some people are raising their hands. It's not the turn of the audience. It's after the interview is over that you'll be able to, sorry, it's after the two have finished that members of the audience will talk. We've received over 400 questions, but we'll only be taking questions from those who are on Zoom. If I know the biographer of the president, I will send him or her all these 400 questions. There's so many on land, on xenophobia, HIV, AIDS, corruption, some of the issues that the president has spoken about. Moloku, please, we appreciate your song again. The president did not hear the Happy Birthday song, so you should repeat that and give us one or two additional songs. Thank you.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. We wish you long life. 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 And may the good Lord bless you.
Well,
May the good Lord bless you. May the good Lord bless you.
she's having some internet failure. Thank you very much. Do you want another song, or you're still experiencing Zoom problem?
No, sir. Did you hear me?
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. So the poet, please do not raise your hands to ask questions. We are not there yet, please. We will bring the audience, but not now. Please, our poet, Aduwo Oluwatimileyin, please. accept his description as a hero. Thank you very much. Let's go back to Naledi.
Naledi?
Wow. Moloku and Aduwo, you guys have done a phenomenal job. And Prof, thank you so much for that. I actually have shivers. I actually have shivers having listened to those two young people. And President, here's the reality of it. We don't know what their future is going to look like for young people that are that passionate. Professor Zeleza asked you earlier, what do you think the future is for South Africa? And your response is a little bit heartbreaking in the sense that you've talked about that renewal not yet having taken place. I imagine that Moloku and Aduwo, even in South Africa, wants to know what the next step is. When you look at our generation, President, are there leaders that you think represent that renewed leadership that we have, not necessarily within the African National Congress, but are there shoots of hope in my generation that you think can carry on the good work? And where are they? I'm happy to hear some names as well.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that one of the things that's very encouraging in this situation of gloom, really, in South Africa, is exactly this thing about the presence of young people who are really very determined to help to bring about change. Notions that you have with a generation that has become disaffected and is not interested is not true. In my experience, not at all true. That you've got young people who are very, very upset about where their country is, and not only about their own interests as young people, that we don't have a job, we don't have this. That is true. But I think a concern which is larger than themselves. I think that's one of the great encouraging things here. And I come back, Naledi, to something I said earlier. I think it is critically important that our young people, the ones I'm talking about, should be organized. You need a very strong youth movement. A strong youth movement, very conscious and very deliberate in what it does. To not only to complain about what are the wrong things that they can see, but to answer the question, therefore, what do we do? Because a lot of us in South Africa here spend a lot of time bemoaning our reality, which is understandable. It must happen. But at the end of it, we must have an answer to this challenge. You say, well, what do we do? I'm saying, I think what is critically important is the building up of the strong youth movement. I'm not talking about that in a partisan sense, ANC or not ANC or whatever. These young people who I'm saying, in my own experience, are really genuinely very concerned about what do they contribute to the rebuilding of the country, to solving its problems and so on. And to make that voice effective, they need to be organized. And also to improve the possibility for them entering these positions of leadership. That organization becomes important. But certainly, I know for a fact. Let me just give you one example. Young doctors, African doctors I'm talking about, they formed an organization they call themselves the Harambee Organization.
Yes.
Taking the name from Kiswahili. And what they are saying is that it's very important for the medical profession here to do a lot of research about diseases, the burden of diseases on our continent. We need a lot of researchers and not count on somebody coming from America or England or somewhere else to do this research for us. We must do the research, including development of vaccines and so on, to address the African health condition. But they say, we are not producing enough medical PhDs, who would then be the researchers. So we must put money together from our own earnings in order to put some of us into further studies so that they acquire these PhDs. That also includes, they say, we need more Black teachers, professors at medical schools who also need PhDs. So you need PhDs in order to produce other PhDs. And so they group themselves together as a Harambee group and take money out of their own pockets. They've never issued any public appeal. They take money out of their own pockets to finance the training of these other young people to become these PhDs. Now, you see, now, lady, what I'm saying. These are young doctors, young Black doctors. They took this thing on their own. I know about it because they then came to report, this is what we are doing. And so what can we do more to support them? But it was their initiative, their conceptualization, and that program is continuing. So with young people of that kind, you cannot have but hope.
Yeah, that's active citizenry, and it exists. I'm going to take
Absolutely.
it, I'm going to make it my responsibility now to tell more and more of those stories so that we see more of the examples, and perhaps the gloom will start to lift a little bit. And in the spirit of lifting the gloom, I know that, Mr. President, you've been working on your presidential center, and that's a very exciting initiative. And when I realized what you were doing, I thought about some of my early days as a very young student journalist who really started getting her awakening about what role I wanted to play in my life and in my work as a media practitioner, when an older brother of mine taught me about Hannibal the warrior. And I thought, really? That's a part of our history? I did not know this. And I know that that's part of something that's very passionate for you, is telling those kinds of stories. And so one of the things I wanted to ask was, the ages of 16 to 24 are the most vulnerable years for young African women. If I say, who is that leader, that warrior woman that you would advise a 17-year-old and say, here's a book, go and dive into it and throw yourself into it and read up about this female African leader, and your perspective of yourself will change?
That's a difficult one. There is a lot of literature, as you know, on the issue of women's empowerment, women's emancipation, very important literature of that kind. And I'm not sure that I have, I'm aware of particular books which are sort of autobiographies of the kind you are describing. But in terms of putting together a number of books to say to a young woman of the kind of the years that you are talking about, have a look at all of this. I think it wouldn't be difficult to put a collection of literature like that. But again, I want to come back to this matter of organization. That I would also say to young women like that, it's also important that for us, as these young women, we must find a way of engaging one another, of strengthening the bonds and ties among ourselves, so that it must also be possible for us to stand up. There might be particular concerns, matters that are of concern to us as this age group of young women. Let's stand up together to say, here is an issue that needs to be addressed. This is the problem. This is what we think are the solutions. So I'm saying the matter of organization becomes important. But the kind of literature, the exposure to experiences of women elsewhere in the world, or even in South Africa, it is possible to do that. It might not, I'm not find a typical autobiography that would address the things that you are saying, but I think it wouldn't be too difficult to put together the necessary volume of information.
Yeah, well, I'll keep looking for some of them as well. I know that there's been some great literature that's been written for children, the likes of 100 Great African Kings and Queens that will teach young people about the likes of Queen Zinga, Sheba. Those are the stories that young people get excited about because they see themselves as those warriors as well, and it changes their views of what they think is possible. Prof. Seleza?
So
following up on the very exciting issues of ideas and intellectual life. President Mbeki, you are widely seen as a political leader who's also an intellectual in the hallowed tradition of Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. What do you regard as some of your main contributions to African social thought, as Samir Amin would put it?
No, Professor Seleza, I think you are the person to answer that question. Not me.
Yes.
I really can't. Okay. I think it would be arrogance on my part if I were to answer.
All right.
But what I can say,
yes,
really genuinely, I spoke earlier about a little contribution that South Africans we made to this challenge of African development. You will recall this at some point. We raise again, it was not a new thing, we raise again this challenge of an African Renaissance, a rebirth of the continent. That the challenge we face in this African Renaissance is that rebirth. Therefore, meaning that there's so many things that need to change for us to have the Africa that we want. And what was really very, very, very inspiring to me was how that was developing into a Pan-African movement with people in various African countries forming a Renaissance movement, chapters of the Renaissance movement. I thought that was very, very inspiring because we were not just, it's not just talking and then being covered on TV or radio or somewhere, but the ordinary people on the continent say, we've heard you, we are part of that process. That generation of a movement for the Renaissance of Africa, I think that was a very, very proud moment, certainly for me. It's not a unique contribution, but I think a contribution nonetheless.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mr. President. You are widely known as a key architect of the idea of the African Renaissance, which of course can be traced back in history, in South Africa's own history. So Plaje, wrote about the African Renaissance. He has a beautiful essay from 1905. And Nanda Azikiwe also wrote about it in 1937. And one can go back to the 19th century with the great Pan-Africanists. But for the modern era, you are really identified as the architect of that idea that spread, as you rightly said, across the continent. And one of the effects of the spread of this notion of the African Renaissance was, to use the term you used before with regards to the ANC, is try to renew the African vision for the future. And part of that renewal was, of course, the establishment of the transition from the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, to the African Union, and the creation of NEPAD, in which, again, you were a very key architect. Where do you think the idea of the African Renaissance is today in terms of Pan-Africanism? In other words, where are we in terms of Pan-Africanism, and how well do you think these two key institutions in which you played a key role based on your ideas of the African Renaissance and Renewal, the African Union and NEPAD are in realizing, again, the great expectations originally envisaged?
Well, Professor Zeleza, that is a challenging question, in part because, as you were saying, I think Professor Falola was saying earlier, I've got many tasks that the African Union has given to me to carry out on the continent. And so I don't want my masters to be angry with me for what I'd say. But I think the reality, one of the painful realities on our continent is I think there is a sharply reduced commitment to Pan-Africanism on the continent. That sense of cohesion on the continent, that together we must pursue these following outcomes, I think has reduced radically. I don't know why. Pan-Africanism has declined. It's maybe because our political leaders in the country are quite correctly focused on their own countries and responding to their national challenge, maybe, but it's unfortunate. I'm saying the loss of this Pan-African commitment, Pan-Africanist commitment. You see it in the functioning of the African Union. There are changes, for instance, that have been brought about. It's a very welcome process, which was led by President Kagame. Really to look at the organization, to make sure that it functions effectively, efficiently, and really delivers in terms of the objectives of the union. But mistakes occur in the process of that. For instance, because one of the focal points became cost reduction. We must reduce the cost of running the institution so that we can use those funds for development and so on. So one of the things that's happened is that we've integrated the political affairs department with peace and security. So that particular commission is now called Political Affairs, Peace and Security. You will know this, Professor Zeleza, very well, that you are by that means killing the political element. Because the matters of peace and security are banging on the table of the AU every day. It's inevitable they will take precedence. The conflict in the Sahel, continuing conflict in Somalia, new conflict in Mozambique, Eastern Congo, and Libya, and so on. That will kill the political focus. And yet the political focus is the key, that's the house of change, and the instrument of change. If you want to produce this united Africa, if you want to produce this renaissance, it needs political leadership.
Mm.
You can't close down the Commission on Political Affairs. You can, sure, it's very, very important to solve the conflicts. But having solved the conflicts, we still have to come back to this matter. These basic objectives of the African Union, what have we done to bring them closer? As I say, unity, renaissance in all of this. And yet, because I think, because of this drop in this commitment to this Pan-Africanist perspective of the continent, the AU summit actually decided, no, let's close down the Commission on Political Affairs on it as a standalone and integrate it with peace and security. I'm saying that is to kill the political one. No, you can't reconstruct and lead the continent to its unity, whatever, without that political leadership. So I'm saying there are manifestations of that weakening of the Pan-Africanist perspective, even in the functioning of the African Union. How we correct this, I don't know. Perhaps it's the younger people who should come and reclaim that Pan-Africanism, which again, Professor Zeleza, as you say correctly, already in the 19th century, the African intellectuals and leaders of that time were talking in this Pan-Africanist terms. It's going to maybe need the younger generation to re-engage this matter, because the current leadership, I think, has really strayed away significantly from this commitment to a Pan-Africanist perspective. So that then impacts Professor Zeleza on the, I've spoken a little bit about the institution of the Union, the African Union, but also these other matters. You know, with regard to NEPAD, for instance, the first chairperson of the Commission of the African Union, you'll recall, was President Konare from Mali. And President Konare said to me, he's going to insist that the Secretariat of NEPAD remains in South Africa and not brought to Addis. Let it stay in South Africa. Number two, is going to insist that the NEPAD must be run, this is a project of the African Union, but it must be run on its own and not integrated into the structures of the African Union. Because he says to me, if we integrate it in the structures of the African Union, it will die. It's necessary that it must continue in this autonomous thing, condition under the leadership of the AU, but not physically integrated, structurally integrated in the system. Well, after Professor Konare left, other people didn't have the same ideas and went for this integration and so on. So that's why I think what President Konare was saying happened. It now becomes part of a bureaucracy of a big organization, and you then treat it in a routine fashion, this NEPAD, and what it sought to achieve in terms of integrated African development. So at the root cause of all of this, I think, is the weakening of a Pan-Africanist perspective, and therefore a commitment to those Pan-Africanist goals. How we address that, I don't know, but I think that's the reality.
Thank you. This is very enlightening on what has been going on. Thank you for sharing those insights. Naledi?
Thank you, Prof. Zeleza. President Mbeki, you've talked about that responsibility then moving to younger people. I'm going to stay with the younger people. And what we've seen with the Fees Must Fall movement has been those calls for a decolonized education. I imagine those calls are going to continue happening. And we've seen some seeds really starting to come there. But I know that you, President Mbeki, are incredibly passionate about education. But the reality of how things look in South Africa right now is terrifying. At grade 1, we have 1 million children entering the schooling system. By the time they make it to grade 12, only half of them, round about half of them are left. Then you've got, the tiny amounts that will make it into the tertiary education system. And then those numbers look even more frightening when you look at how many of them actually graduate. In the middle of that, we're dropping all of these young people and they're going into empty spaces in the country. do you have ideas on how we start to improve the education system? I mean, I come from 1994, I was 7 years old. So I was one of those children that was the first to go into former Model C schools. And that was a very fortunate thing for me. And I know that there's a lot of us that are fortunate as well, but there's a lot of us that are not. And then it seems that along the way, we started to pick those numbers up, and there were more young people getting quality education, but it doesn't seem that we've been able to keep that momentum going. Any ideas on how we keep it going, President?
Yeah, first of all, Naledi, I agree entirely with what you have said about the crisis we are facing here in South Africa on the matter of education. You're quite correct. I think we can't avoid this conclusion that we need a process led by government, but inclusive, to look at the entirety of our educational system, starting from preschool right up to university and all that. We need to look at the entirety of the system, because as you are indicating, there are many, many things that are wrong.
Mm. I
I think this is a thing that we must argue for and really push for it to happen, because the system is not working well. You know, if it take for instance, the further education and training college, TVET colleges, technical colleges, which are supposed to produce the skilled workers. Look at their condition. They are not producing those skilled workers, certainly not in the numbers that are required. And yet, without those skilled workers, you can't even achieve this economic recovery that we're talking about. But why is that? Why is that system of that further training and education in the skills, why is it not working properly? There are many questions of this kind that need to be answered. The dropout rates that you are talking about quite correctly. So I think we can't avoid. There are many, many positive changes that have been done since 1994, many, with all levels of the education system. But still, we're left with this crisis, really. And I think the South Africans need to admit our educational system is in crisis, and therefore let's all sit down, government, teachers, parents, students, all sit down together, trade unions, to say, what do we do about it? I think it's if we don't take that route, I think the situation will get worse.
We've covered the sector of education. I just want to bring in one other key sector, President, and that is the sector of health. The past 3 years, 2.5 years, incredibly difficult for the world. What is your report card on how South Africa, and it would be interesting as well to hear how Africa fared with COVID-19. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a report by Professor Shabir Mahdi that essentially talked about the steps that we would need to follow going into this pandemic. And I remember one of the recommendations being preparing for the large amounts of the dead. And at some point, we saw graves being built in Gauteng that infuriated many South Africans. And then as the numbers really started to come in, we realized that Africa wasn't picking up the numbers at a rate the rest of the world was. So perhaps you could talk about what we've done right as a continent and as a country at home here, and what we did terribly wrong. President.
No, I think that as a country, I think the government on this matter relatively did well in terms of managing this the pandemic. But I think clearly even the medical people would say naturally they didn't understand all aspects of this pandemic at the beginning. They themselves had to go through a learning process to understand how does this virus work and all of that. Because indeed, as you say, some of the prediction, not only about South Africa, but about the continent particularly, was that we're going to have a lot of dead people at the end of it. But it didn't happen, not in the manner in which it was projected. And here in South Africa, part of what used to worry me is that when you watch television and you see that people in these very packed African townships are going around not wearing masks. It used to worry me a great deal, but and I know the conditions in which people live. When you say there must be social distancing, how does it happen? When you have 13, 14, 15 people living in one house, not out of their choice, but because of the problems of the country. Well, how do they social distance themselves? They can't. And I'm saying things like that, but the remarkable thing was that it then didn't produce the numbers of dead people that were being postulated by medical scientists. Again, I would say it's quite clear that even medical science itself took time to understand this phenomenon. But I think overall, we've done well. But it has emphasized, obviously, this question about the need for the continent, not only South Africa, to develop its own capacity to deal with pandemics like this. That means the capacity to produce drugs and medicines and other interventions, non-pharmaceutical interventions. It must be possible. The continent needs that possibility because there will be another pandemic tomorrow. Do we have the infrastructure to produce these things that are required? Because of course, as you know, the big complaint about the drugs has been that there's an apartheid, virus apartheid in the world, a vaccine apartheid in the world, such that the rich oversupply themselves with the vaccine and the poor get nothing. So you got to correct that by increasing the capacity on the continent to be able to deal with things like that. But I think that generally, with all of those challenges about vaccines and so on, I think generally the continent has handled the matter fairly well.
Yeah, I have to say I agree there with you, Mr. President. This was my second last round. I think I just have one more, Professor Zeleza, and just a quick correction. I think I said that the report earlier about that expected that there'd be millions of dead people due to COVID-19. I said it was Professor Shabir Mahdi. I think I might be wrong. So please, I need to make that correction on record. It might have been Professor Salim Karim. Again, on record, I need to go and double check that in case I get myself into trouble tomorrow. Professor Zeleza?
Thank you very much.
Professor Zeleza, let me thank you because this is your final round of questions, and I want to thank you ahead of time, and I will give Naneldi another final, and then you've missed so many questions, and I will cover all your misses.
All right. So I have two final questions for you, Mr. President. It's really been a pleasure talking to you. And as you said, we could talk for a very long time, and I look forward to that opportunity sometime soon. After you left the presidency, as Toyin Falola indicated, and you also made the references, you've been involved in numerous international mediation efforts across the continent, including the Sudan, Zimbabwe, and so on and so forth. How do you assess those efforts at mediation? And perhaps more fundamentally or more broadly, how can the continent rid itself of these perennial conflicts? Having spent a lot of your time in these efforts, I'm sure you've come to an understanding of what leads to some of these challenges. Of course, each conflict has its own character, but how do we as a continent transcend these perennial conflicts?
Paul, Mr. President, before you answer the question, Paul, are these conflicts actually enough? Are they many? Are we not exaggerating the number?
Well, there's been a change in the nature of conflicts across Africa,
Yes.
but certainly the president, having spent his time in some of them, he might share with us some of the ideas. Of course, there's been a shift in the nature of those conflicts over time.
Thank you.
Yes, no, I think, Professor Zeleza, what we need to do as a continent is really, again, to sit down and say, collectively, when we put together a history of these conflicts and our interventions, what are our conclusions? I think what we would find is that actually the African Union has the correct architecture and appropriate architecture to address these matters. For instance, for years now, we've had the AU has had an early warning system. Now, that would be a very critical intervention in terms of preventing the conflicts from breaking out. Because you can see this thing building, or let's give you a specific example, one of the latest. You remember the civil war in South Sudan broke out in 2013. You could see it coming. We were dealing from the AU side, we were dealing with the Sudans, both South and then Sudan and South Sudan. We could see the conflict coming. We intervened to engage it, to avoid a situation where in the end you would get to the conflict. In the end, we failed. But what I'm saying, the AU has an early warning system. Let's look at it, is it functioning? Because in many instances, you can tell. You can tell that if this matter is not addressed, its result is going to be the conflict. We look at this matter about how then conflicts have been addressed. To stop the guns shooting, fine, the guns stop shooting. Now let's get together and develop a new constitution, which is done. Then let's have elections and put in a new government. Broadly, this kind of response. What it doesn't do is to pose the question, what caused this conflict in the first place? And therefore, part of your conflict resolution must be to address those root causes of the conflict. So you should not be satisfied that the guns have been silenced and that you got now this president who took power wearing a military uniform is now a president wearing a suit. So the problem is solved without addressing this matter about the root causes. So I'm saying the African Union, if it looked at its own experience critically, it would be able to identify the weaknesses in terms of an intervention. And I think, again, just to give you another example, Mali, conflict in Mali currently. I don't think it will be too difficult looking at the history of Mali since independence. I don't think it would have been too difficult to foresee what was likely to happen with regard to the kind of conflicts that we've seen, including a coup d'etat. The Malian military government now, I'm going to be seeing them later this month. They want to come so that we discuss this reality of Mali and why they are insisting that there needs to be a couple of 2 years, they say, of a national dialogue among the Malians before they go to the next elections. Because they're saying we can go to the next elections next month. But the military conflict will continue and the coup d'etat will take place. But I'm saying, Professor Zeleza, that I think just to look, if the AU, if it looked at its own architecture, it would find within that architecture that if it did all of these things that are there in policy, if they were done, then it would do a lot in order to reduce the incidence of this violence.
Thank you, Mr. President. My last question for you, as one of Africa's great statesmen, is, you know, the contemporary world is facing many challenges. Some of them, of course, have been there before, they have accelerated, some have new expressions, including the devastations of climate change, disruptions of the fourth industrial revolution, intensifying hegemonic rivalries between the United States and China, and of course, a perennial problem of growing socioeconomic inequalities. And more recently, we have witnessed democratic backsliding or democratic recessions around the world, including among the so-called mature democracies. Could you share your thoughts you know, on any of these challenges, and more importantly, how you think Africa can reposition itself to be a player rather than a pawn in navigating global challenges, to use Ali Mazroui's phrase?
Yeah, thanks. Professor Zeleza, before I answer your question, let me say, I don't know how much I owe you, because in many of the speeches I've had to make and interventions I've made, I've quoted you, particularly on questions of education and higher education. I want to say thanks a lot for the work you've done in this field. It's been very, very useful to me to educate me and to give me guidance in terms of how we should go forward. But thanks a lot for that.
Thank you, sir.
But on this matter you raise, again, it's always been my view about many of these things that, for instance, to be a useful role of leadership, one has got to understand the reality you are dealing with. This question that you are raising has got to do with the distribution of power globally. What do you say about that? And where does Africa belong in that context? You see, for instance, if one looks at Professor Zeleza, I'm sure you know this, at US policy. For many years, US policy, foreign policy, has been informed by what is called the Wolfowitz doctrine. It's a doctrine produced originally by Paul Wolfowitz, basically saying, at the end of the Cold War, the United States must not allow that there should be the emergence of any power which can challenge the United States. That's the Wolfowitz doctrine, which got integrated into US national security doctrine. So the US must never allow that you've got alternative powers that emerge that are going to challenge its interests in any way. That's why it's in that context that this debate has arisen about multilateralism against the unipolar world, and all of that. That's part of what educates this. And then, of course, you will get the emergence. China grows economically and in other ways. It would run head-on into collision with that kind of perspective, which will come from some cycles in the United States. And the Russians also would respond because they pose the question. The Warsaw Pact has been closed down. Why do you need NATO? What enemies does NATO have? And then why does it creep up to the borders of Russia? Those questions will arise in the context of this repositioning of power relations. Now, therefore, the continent, the African continent itself, needs to, I'm saying, Professor Leza, to understand reality. It must itself engage that discussion. This is what is happening in the world in terms of the distribution of political power, the distribution of economic power, of technological power. Where are we as Africans? You see, even what I was talking about earlier, the continent decides and adopts NAPAD, whatever its weaknesses. This is Africa's perspective about its development. We then say to the G8, your relations, your economic relations particularly with the African continent, must be based on Africa's own perspective about itself. So they agreed. So, okay, in which case, we're going to need a joint committee to ensure mutual accountability. So we, the Africans, will do what we have to do in terms of the perspective we put forward of NAPA. And you, G8, must do what you committed to do in terms of the G8 Africa Action Plan. And so we form a committee of mutual accountability. And it was formed. And one of the conditions was the people that the G8 would appoint would be people who would have immediate access to their head of government. For instance, in France, President Chirac appointed Michel Camdessou. You remember Michel Camdessou used to be the head of IMF.
IMF, yeah.
Very senior person who reported directly to President Chirac. That was agreement, that that's how these committees would be constituted. And it worked for a few years. The African continent must say, why did that happen? Why did it work? Can we get back to that situation? So I think we haven't done that as a continent to assess the global distribution of power and therefore locate ourselves in that context so that we are also able to act as an independent force in our own interests as Africans. We haven't done it, but it needs to happen.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's been a pleasure for me talking to you on behalf of the audience. Naledi?
Well, Naledi, I will only allow you one question. The president has been with us for 2 hours, 17 minutes. And in 15 minutes, I will close the program. But I have to also allow members of the audience to ask 1 or 2 questions. Please, one question. And then we're very grateful for your participation. And I've enjoyed all your questions. Your final question, please.
Thank you so much, Professor. Mr. President, my final question will be, and I'm going to keep this one very brief. South Africa is still recovering from July 2021. I think over the days of the July unrest, we actually got scared as a nation that we were burning our country to ashes. God forbid we find ourselves in that position again. What do we say to our people?
What we should say, Naledi, to our people is that the event you are talking about of July 2021, when among the things that happened was this mass looting of shops and so on, is that was deliberately organized. There's a group of people who got together and provoked that and made sure that it happened. We're back to what I was discussing much earlier. That part of the challenge that South Africa, we have faced in South Africa, is the threat of counter-revolution. The people who led that process of July 2021, are exactly this kind of people who do not want this democracy to succeed.
Mm.
And among other things, to show that Black people can't govern properly. It was a deliberate, conscious intervention. Now, we've got to uproot that tendency, because they can try something else tomorrow as destructive. The story that is told that, no, this was a result of a quarrel among ANC members, no, that's not true. The ANC members might be quarreling among themselves, I don't debate that. But I'm saying because of this thing, we've got to deal with this challenge of people who don't want this country to succeed and will do anything and everything to make sure that it fails. We've got to find them. It's not just a police matter, but I think it is a police matter. It's an intelligence matter, but it's also a political matter. We've got to find a way of addressing this thing because those forces are there. They want South Africa to fail because it communicates a particular political message. And they would want then to make sure that South Africa develops according to their own liking.
Mm.
That's what we should say to our people and not deceive them. To say that it may happen again until we've dealt with these forces, which are somewhere there embedded in our society.
Mm.
Thank you very much, Naneldi. We're very grateful. We are honored. I would like to thank the media who are here, Vanguard, Guardian, Tribune, Punch, all of whom will be carrying the analysis of these interviews during the week. Here is the way I want to proceed. I want to honor members of the audience who are counting. They're from various countries. I would like you ask all your questions all at once, and the president will make his closing statements, and I will ask the foundation to communicate with you in answering some of the questions. So I will give the president one more opportunity after you've asked all your questions to answer anyone he has the energy to do and make his closing remarks. In other words, I will not be doing it one person, the president, one person, the president. He's an 80-year-old man. And you know, he's been very busy, Thabo Mbeki Day, African Union Day. And yesterday, there was the Thabo Mbeki dinner. I don't know where he's gotten the energy to be here today doing this interview. And I pray to be 80 myself and to have his kind of energy. Please, if your Zoom doesn't work in time, I will shut you out. Mr. President, we have questions on China. You don't have to answer it. On land, why is there no land policy to redistribute land? Questions, will the ANC collapse? Will South Africa become like Nigeria in terms of the scale of corruption? Why must there be violence whenever people protest, destroying public property as it happened in Durban and Joburg following the Zuma crisis? Can they protest without destroying public property, knowing full well that they're going to pay a price for it? So let's take some, and let me recognize so many people in the audience, the ambassador of Ghana, some ambassadors, I recognize Ambassador Busia from Brazil, and so many others. I do not promise I will call all of you. If I don't call you, please don't be angry. Professor Sibusiso Nkuma, the Dean of Thabo Mbeki School, please ask your question. The president is not obligated to answer for now, so that he can take a rest. Professor Vil Nkomo. Vil Nkomo, please go ahead. Professor Vilin Como, are you there? Okay, why waiting for Vilin Como? Can I call Mbembe Martin, Ihembe Martin? Martin? Please, go ahead, please. Introduce yourself and be quick.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Good evening, Your Excellency. My name is Martin Ihembe. I'm a student at a doctoral student at the University of Pretoria here. Your Excellency, quickly, I would like to have your take on, if you wouldn't mind, on the issue of electoral reform. Looking forward to the 2024 election and in the light of the Constitutional Court ruling that mandated the Parliament to amend the Electoral Act before that election. During your administration, you did set up the CIBLAT Commission to look into the Electoral Act in South Africa with respect to the issue of seeing whether the candidacy, the constituency element can be added to the proportional representation in South Africa. That didn't see the light of the day, although you did your best. Now, the Constitutional Court has given a ruling mandating the Parliament to work on that. Were you in office or looking back, what would you do differently, or what advice would you have to give to the government of the day? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. He will, in his closing statement, he may address your question. King Fonkem Achankeng, the king of Bamanda land from Cameroon. Your Excellency, please. Your Excellency, Fonkem Achankeng. Your Royal Highness, please ask your question. Please unmute his Royal Highness.
Thank you very much, Prof. Your Excellency, President Mbeki, we are so glad to have you on the Falola interview series. I want to begin by one thing you said, that you have many tasks that the African Union has given to you to carry out. And that those tasks are because of who you are and who you've been. I want to assure you that all of Africa is still looking up to you. Now, I know two words or two concepts are very dear and near to your heart: self-esteem and the destruction of a people's sense of identity. These, because growing up in the colonial and apartheid South Africa and participating in the struggle, the liberation struggle for self-esteem of a people, would you, Mr. President, consider Africa today as free of colonialism? I say this because whenever historians have used the term colonialism, they have looked at European colonialism or Western colonialism or other colonialisms. Is there a difference between black and black colonialism? Or is there still part of that on our continent?
Thank you
very much, sir.
Thank you, Your Royal Highness, King from Bamenda land, Cameroon, Professor Samuel Onotoba of Calgary University, Canada. Please be brief. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, sir, Prof, for the opportunity and the privilege. The President, happy birthday, sir, and our philosopher king. Yes, I just have this question. You mentioned something in a Thinker article you wrote in 2014, that there are lack of progressive forces in Africa in our contemporary time. You compared it to the 1970s and 1980s. How do we build these progressive forces? And two, Cornel West talked about Black prophetic fire. We lack this fire today. You epitomize that fire in terms of commitment and passion for Africa. How do we build this kind of people who are genuinely committed to the continent beyond self-interest? Thank you, sir.
Opposed to Nosizizwe, opposed to Nosizizwe. Opposed to Nosizwe, please ask your question.
Thank you, Excellency. Thank you so much, Mr. President, for such a wonderful presentation and input on what needs to happen in South Africa and also in Africa moving forward. My question is that I'm an author. To date, have written up to 7 books published. And my last book is The Great Reset of Africa. And my subtitle is Resolutions, Strategies, and Sustainable Developmental Priorities Towards Agenda 2063. My intention with the book is to encourage participation of One Africa, redefining Africa's global posture. And I would like my contribution actually to go into committees that will influence towards the Agenda 2063 and not just only waiting towards that time, but what processes does one have to follow to be able to have their work recognized. I have already started engaging with platforms like universities locally. Next month, UJ will be having a conversation and a dialogue on the book. And my work has already been invited for a policy reform conference in Turkey in December. But I'm just feeling like I need to get a clarity with regards to on policy reforms, what platforms do I need to participate on for the resolutions and the strategies that I've made recommendation for towards Agenda 2063.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Professor Chris Isike, Director, the Study of the United States in Africa, University of Pretoria. Professor Isike, comments or question? Go ahead, please, sir.
Okay. Good evening, Mr. President, and congratulations on your 80th birthday. My question is simple. I just want to know your thoughts on the need for us to rethink the Westphalian state system we inherited in Africa. Do you think that we really need to rethink and then redesign these state systems in the first place because they are the fulcrum of most of the problems we have in the continent?
Thank you, Professor Isike. Dejitoye from Nigeria. Dejitoye, your questions, please, or your comments. Please go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening, Mr. President. Happy birthday to you. I want to ask a question about your reflection. I want a reflection by you on the transition that happened in South Africa in 1994 after ANC took over. I mean, in terms of the economic, redistributional justice and all of that. Thinking back today, would you say that an ANC perhaps should have emphasized more on delivering of social services? I mean, lower level redistribution as against emphasis on things like Black economic empowerment, much of which went ahead to benefit a lot of ANC party chiefs. Do you think that part of the problem, for example, we're talking about the crisis in 2021 in South Africa, we're talking even about fallouts in terms of, xenophobia. So would you say that if there had been more emphasis in 1994, perhaps you would have, there will be less tension at lower level in South Africa today?
Thank you, sir. Dr. Metuge. Dr. Metuge. Dr. Metuge, are you there? Dr. Metuge.
Okay, I'm trying to, okay, yeah, I want to thank the president for giving us such an opportunity to be here. And it's a great pleasure, a great man who've lived a life Africans would want to imitate. So, Mr. President, I just have a direct question on what is happening in the Cameroons and the southern Cameroons. I don't know, Africa has been sleeping and they are still sleeping. For how long will Africans wait or to see that the southern and Anglophone Cameroons, or the English speaking, we call them southern Cameroons, for how many millions would Africans stay behind and watch for them to be murdered before Africans will come up and intervene, Mr. President?
Thank you, sir. Tola Oshunuga. That's a name from Nigeria. Please, Tola Oshunuga. Tola Oshunuga. Yes,
Thank you very much, Mr. President. My name is Tola Oshunuga. I lecture Yoruba literature in the UK, where I live at the moment. My question to you, sir, is this. What is your thought, or what is AU's thought about the Rwandan asylum plan by the UK, in which they give a one-way ticket to people who seek refuge here and transport them to Rwanda? And Rwanda government is so ecstatic and enthusiastic about it. What is Africans' view? Any opposition?
Thank you. No si muko ena. No si muko ena. No si muko ena. No si muko ena.
Thank you so much, the facilitator. My question is more on the renewal. I think the concept and the project renewal is a fairly understandable and a way to go. But now I need to know from the president, with an evident conflicting ANC where we have camps and we have factions, how do we hope to get the renewal project off the ground? Are we really gonna get it off the ground? And I think it's evident now that the tensions are intensifying, such that focus is just going. Are we really gonna win this battle of a renewal project? Thank you so much. And happy birthday, President.
Thank you very much. If I don't call you, please, you have to forgive me. Where the time we negotiated is out, but I'm allowing the president to rest. Please, candidate a guy. Please be fast, and I cannot call all of you. Please go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the chance to talk. Happy birthday to Mr. President. This is Canada guy. I'm a citizen of Southern Cameroon. We've been in civil war or conflict, we call it, for 6 years now. We've approached African leaders, current and formal. We have approached African states, African Union, and unfortunately, all of these bury their head in the sand. And in that frustration, we tend to approach the European nations, the Western world, and the question they ask us is, what are your African brothers doing to help you people? What are your African brothers doing to help you before you rush to us? So Mr. President said, or I've read that he has been involved in many conflicts in Africa in terms of trying to negotiate or resolve conflicts. What is the difference between the conflicts he has been trying to resolve and that which is eating up population in the English-speaking Cameroon?
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you. Lebongang Hume. We've had questions. Please.
Thank you very much, facilitator. Good evening, President. 2 questions, basically. President, you made reference to the quality of membership within the ANC. Has the ANC, I'm posing this question to you as an elder and a member of the ANC. Have the ANC considered the process of membership that is followed by the Communist Party of China, which is an arduous process that in any case, a candidate will only be a member after a period of years. This is to ensure that we have a quality membership within the organization. Secondly, what is your take with regard to African countries which were formerly French colonies that are still paying tax to France? What is your guidance with regard to this? Perhaps also to the AU. Thank you very much.
Vichumbiko Gondwe. I'm trying to be very respectful of the audience. We don't have time, so be very quick. Please, sir.
Yes. Thank you so much for the opportunity and happy birthday, President Thabo Mbeki. Mr. President, my question is, what is your philosophy approach when you are making the big picture decisions in Africa? What I'm saying, why I'm saying this is because you as a thought leader, and what we have learned at Timali is to think and use our brain to resolve problems that we face in Africa. But what I find is how the problem is how do you make it so that maybe we can learn from you how to solve those problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm associated with Timali. We brought him to answer questions from students. Maybe they have to do more of that. Mastanj, we are running out of time.
Professor Falola.
Yes, please.
I've got 12 questions here. Now, how many are you going to put for me to answer?
Yes.
The more you put questions, some of them I won't have time to answer them.
Yes, sir. That is the idea, sir. That if you have energy, we can keep going. But your staff have been sending me messages that I should stop. But if you have energy, that's why I wasn't allowing you to answer the question so that you can regain your energy. But you don't have to answer all the questions.
That would not be fair, Professor. Well, I think once people pose questions, we need to take that seriously.
I'm very happy that your energy is back. Please answer some of these questions. Thanks for overruling your staff.
Let's allow for, I'm sympathetic to your position. Let's allow for 3 more questions and that would be the last.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Okay,
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Happy birthday, Mr. President. You're doing a great job. And we do appreciate all the help that you've been doing in resolving conflicts in the continent of Africa. The problem we have in the southern Cameroons, the former British Cameroon, is that the early warning system does not seem to have worked for the people of southern Cameroons, because we've been in this conflict. It had been building up for almost 61 years, and it finally came to hit in 2016, 2017. And the African Union has done nothing to even come and mediate or even come and make peace in the area, to come and intervene. Why is the African Union allowing their brothers in southern Cameroon to be slaughtered by the La République military? What is your take on this, Mr. President? Please, we need help.
Please, if your question is about Cameroon, kindly yield. We've had 4 people talking about Cameroon. Please yield. Noeli Mumpi. No more questions on Southern Cameroon. ANC, we have Noeli Mumpi. Balogun Bokini. Balogun.
Yeah, thank you very much. And happy birthday, Thabo Mbeki. Yes, my question is this. According to the African Charter, Article 20, it says, all people shall have the right to existence. They shall have the unquestionable and inalienable right to self-determination. So my question is this: do you believe in self-determination? And if you do, what's your take on indigenous nations saying they want their own sovereign state? And what do you think could be done to achieve this peacefully? Thank you very much.
Noeli Mumpi. Please unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. We can hear you. We can't hear you.
Hello?
Okay, now go ahead.
Yes, I said that thank you for allowing me to wish a happy birthday to the President Thabo Mbeki and to ask my question. We do appreciate what he's doing to resolve the conflict in the continent throughout Africa, but my concern is remain to the DRC and Rwanda conflict. Why is no one is reprimanding or talking to the President Kagame to stop the hostility that he has been doing for so long to DRC? Because the problem of DRC is, I don't know how to say it, is beyond everyone's control now. It's a time that we need to interpret, it's a time that we need to call up on him to have like a sense of humanity to what has been happening in the east of DRC. I don't know what the President Thabo Mbeki can do or can think of that, because we really need peace on that country. Enough is enough, please. Thank you.
Thank you. And I noticed that people from various countries also want to use this opportunity to pass on messages. Some of these messages will also pass on your behalf, conflicts and things like that. Let me now allow the president to answer the questions. If he says he wants to extend the time, we still have 9 people who want to ask questions. I can't control them. If he has the energy, we keep going. If he says this is going to be his last response, let me apologize to you all. Thank you, Mr. President. The floor is yours now.
And thanks, Professor Falola. No, it will be the last response. First of all, let me say, Professor Falola, on the colleagues who've raised questions about the Cameroon, there is, as people know, a body called the Africa Forum. The Africa Forum is made up of former heads of state, African former heads of state, and other leaders on the continent, like people who were secretaries of the United Nations, like the late Kofi Annan was a member, and people were secretaries or chairpersons at the AU. But as I say, former heads of state in the main, as the Africa Forum. The reason I'm mentioning it is because some people from Cameroon approached me to say, look, here is this problem in Cameroon. Yes, indeed, I know. Do something. So I suggested to them that the best thing to do was to refer this matter to the Africa Forum. This is this leadership on the continent, which is actually very, very, very big and very strong. So we agreed. I referred the matter to the Africa Forum through its chairperson, President Chisano, to say, you know the situation in Cameroon, and somebody needs to do something. So the Africa Forum agreed. And they asked me to then act as the envoy of the chair of the forum on this matter, to be the envoy of President Chisano. So indeed, we've tried to do this. I've tried to contact the President here to say, this is us, the Africa Forum, and we want to help to address the challenges of Cameroon. Unfortunately, there has not been any direct response to me about that. We then set up other processes to make sure that we engage all of the various sections in Cameroon, really to work together to say there's a challenge to be addressed, it must be addressed. Now, the Africa Forum is still committed to play that role. I'm saying that our most immediate challenge has been so far that we haven't had the kind of engagement with the government of Cameroon that we'd expected. We've raised this matter with the African Union to say the African Union also needs to act on it. And as I understand it, at some point, the chair of the AU Commission, Musa Faki, actually went to Yaoundé to engage the government of Cameroon. But so what I'm saying, colleagues, is as the Africa Forum, we'll continue to do our best to make sure that we engage this matter. It is important, has to be addressed. Question, therefore, that was raised earlier. Are we free of colonialism, particularly relating to what was called a black and black colonialism? Again, it was a question of Cameroon. This is the one body we have, the Africa Forum, a former head of state, which is willing and to engage this matter. So we will really continue to do this. So far, I'm saying our biggest challenge has been our inability to link up properly with President Paul Biya and the government of Cameroon. But we are not going to give up on that matter. The question that's raised about the last one, about this conflict between the DRC and Rwanda. I think the only thing I can say about that for now is that as the request has been put, I will engage. I'll try and engage President Kagame and President Tshisekedi. You know, we tried to deal with this question many years ago. But I'll get back to the matter, and hopefully we can help to add some progress on this thing, because I agree this conflict between Rwanda and the DRC, which has been going for a long time, it really needs to be stopped. And so we will do our best to intervene. The matter about the electoral system in South Africa, I appreciate the decision taken by the Constitutional Court that our electoral system must allow for individual candidates to stand and run, to be elected. I agree. I think that is good. I think the law that is now being proposed will contain both elements. This individual membership, but also the party thing. It will maintain the principle of proportional representation, which is very, very important, because it then allows the broadest possible spectrum of opinion to be represented in a legislature like what we're talking about. So I think the amendment by the Constitutional Court of allowing for individual members to run and to be elected, I think it's correct. And the law indeed must make sure we do that. But we must not, in the process of doing that, lose this very important element of proportional representation. Because the first past the post system is very discriminatory. Excludes from the actual exercise of political power by smaller groups, very legitimate, but smaller in society. So the proportional representation thing must remain. But I think the decision was correct to have single members, individual members running for election. We have to be very sensitive about this matter, because what it does, it opens the opportunity for people to be bought. Because to run an election, I want to be elected a member of the South African Parliament. and I must campaign and get the necessary votes. It costs money. And I'm not talking about experience that is new in the world. That there were some people will, because I've got, the money, I might say, I'm ready to finance you. And because you don't have the money, you agree to that. And that builds a sense of obligation on my part as an MP to my sponsor. But it's something that I'm sure we have to watch. I think the observation that was made by one of our colleagues from Canada, I think, about the weakness of the progressive forces on the continent and raising the issue, what do we do to reignite the fire, the sense of commitment and so on. It is a challenge. It relates to the question we were discussing earlier about this reduction in the spirit of Pan-Africanism. How to rebuild the progressive forces on the continent, because indeed correctly, over the years, they've regressed. Whether you talk about the All-African Trade Union Unity, which has disappeared, or the youth movement, or the student movement, or women's movement, and so on. It's one of the tasks as Africans we must do. I think there have been suggestions put to me that we do indeed need to reconvene people from those different forces to answer the question, what is to be done? I think as a foundation, we would be happy to do that. The question about lessons about how to solve conflicts. Generally, wherever I've been involved in matters like that, what we would do is to say, the best thing to do is to get a resolution of the matter at issue by the belligerents themselves, that the answer must come from them, so that they don't have to feel in tomorrow that there's a solution which has been imposed for which they don't take ownership. So normally, for instance, we go to Darfur. The African Union said to us, go to Darfur in Sudan and help us to find a resolution. So indeed we did that. And so we would meet all of the various stakeholders and ask two questions, the same two questions of everybody. In your view, what is the conflict? What's the nature of the conflict? Who caused it? Well, how is it caused? Where does it come from? And number two, how is it to be resolved? So you take these views from all of these role players, stakeholders with regard to that Darfur matter. And they will all respond and have their own various answers. But it's in the context of making sure that they then interact, you facilitate that process, that in the end, an outcome will emerge. Where if there's a consensus that develops, this is a problem, this is a solution. I'm saying we think it's an important way to proceed, because you then don't have the people you think you probably solved the problem and go away and say, well done, Mr. Facilitator. And the thing doesn't stick. Because people say, the first people came, they knew what was wrong with our country and with us. They imposed a solution. It's not ours. Then the thing collapses. So it's not a correct way to proceed, in my view. The question about the renewal of the ANC, whether this will actually happen. My experience, I've been going around, as the people in South Africa will have seen that. I've been visiting various provinces, talking to the ANC membership in these provinces. And I'm quite convinced that there are many, many, many thousands of ANC members who are genuine ANC members, who understand what is wrong and want to make sure that it changes. So it's not as though there might be misbehavior on part of some of the leadership of the ANC, but it would be wrong to think that that is typical of all members of the ANC. It isn't. So there is, I think, sufficient a body of opinion within the ANC which would want to carry this burden of renewal. And I think we've got to work on that basis. The matter about Rwanda accepting people from the United Kingdom, this asylum issue, I honestly don't know what the AU thinks. I don't know whether the AU has discussed it. Certainly I haven't. I've been following it in the media. My view was that I will need to get back to President Kagame just to get an explanation of this. What is this thing all about? And so on, before one can have a real comment about it, a view. But as I say, I've only been following it in terms of the media. But clearly it's a matter that I'm sure as Africans, we would be interested in, and therefore I'm sure we would want to, I would certainly follow it up from that point of view. You know, when I was asked by the African Union 2005 or something like that, to intervene in the Côte d'Ivoire. You remember that conflict, which ended up in 2010, the presidential election at the end of 2010, which became contested. In the end, President Ouattara was proclaimed president, and then President Gbagbo ended up in The Hague, is now back home, and so on. One of the big issues about that was a matter of the continuing relations between Côte d'Ivoire and France. For instance, there was then an agreement which had been signed at independence, allowing the French to have a military base in Abidjan. And indeed, to go further than that, to intervene in the DRC under certain circumstances. This was one of the challenges that President Gbagbo's people, his party, and himself were saying those arrangements of the past needed to be changed. I don't know what has happened with regard to that, but certainly I think the point is raised correctly, that the matter of these relations with former colonial powers, we all need to look at that. Perpetuation of colonialism, neo-colonialism on the continent, I think is a reality. It might manifest itself in many ways, but these are some of them, these military agreements. And also it has been said that the obligations on some of these countries to bank their reserves, currency reserves in France and all that. And clearly, these are matters that have to be addressed. But again, you see, I think that brings us back to this matter that was raised correctly. Where are the progressive forces on the continent? Because I think a matter like that, which is the defeat of neocolonialism, I don't think we can leave it to individual countries as a continent. As a continent, as we united to defeat colonialism, I think we need to unite to defeat neocolonialism also. But again, you'll come back to this question. Do the political forces exist on the continent which would take on a challenge of that kind? It's something that we have got to work on it. As would be the matter that's raised about the Westphalian state system. Yes, indeed, it's true that in many instances, questions arise whether the state system we have constructed post the colonial period is the right one. But these are very, very fundamental things. Again, I think you need people who would be inspired, for instance, committed, fired up, as was said, by this Pan-Africanist perspective. Let's get together and look at this. Might result in the shaking up of states, but you need the certain organized progressive forces to be able to engage that matter. And I don't think they exist on the continent as of now. And it does not mean those of us who got a voice shouldn't make our voice heard. But I'm saying I don't think there are the political forces on the continent as of now, which would be ready to take on a matter of that kind. I don't want to go back to one of our colleagues from Nigeria, raised a matter about what would I think of what we did since 1994. Mentioned, for instance, this Black economic empowerment, which is said benefited a few. You see, so I don't really want to go back there. But what I said earlier about that is really that one has got to study very carefully what the matter that we want to discuss. What is the objective reality? For instance, this view that we had Black economic empowerment, which has benefited a few. I know that view is somewhat prevalent, but it's incorrect. It's because people have not, maybe we have failed. We have failed as South Africans too. To say what was this Black economic, what is it? What outcomes is supposed to look at and so on. So the view that has emerged in South Africa, that this thing has benefited a few, is because the people look at the half a dozen Black people who have become millionaires. And that is the product of BEE. And all of them, nothing to do with government. The government never engaged to support those ones. They interact with the blacks, with the private sector, and then you have that outcome. But the government program to address matter of Black economic empowerment was different. So what I'm saying, I don't want to get into this matter, but one would have to look practically at the reality, not that newspaper headlines, and the actuality and the reality, so that you understand what is this reality, and therefore what needs to be changed, and how must that change be effected. It can only be based on an objective understanding of reality. So I'm saying that, I'm sorry, I don't think we can go back to this in any detail, not today. Our colleague Nosis raised the matter about what institutions can she engage to discuss matters of policy reform. The African Global Post shine the light of Agenda 2063 and matters like that. How do how do we work to ensure that works like her, her own works are recognized and play the role that she was correctly talking about? Well, I think as a foundation, we would want to assist in that regard. Because as far as I can think, in terms of the AU and its processes, I don't think we would be able to get the outcome that she's asking for. But maybe what we should do, colleague Nosizwe, talk to us, and together let's see what can be done to address the matter that you are raising. I don't know which other question I've not answered. Question raised by Palukuna about self-determination. That's a principle which certainly I accept. The right of nations to self-determination. As that phrase has been used in left, certainly in left literature and so on, it includes the phrase up to and including independence. The right of nations to self-determination up to and including independence. I think that is an important political principle. What you do with it in the practice is something else. Because, for instance, there is a reason and a legitimate argument to say it would not be wise on the continent to allow these African states to fracture into small pieces. I'm saying there's legitimacy to that argument. Whether in the practice with regard to country X, you go that route, it may not be correct, may not be true. As happened, for instance, in the case of Sudan. The Sudanese themselves, when they agreed that there must be a referendum of the South Sudan, so that they can decide whether they want to stay with Sudan or separate. But they added to that before the referendum, all effort must be made by themselves, the Sudanese, to make unity attractive. Well, they didn't do that, but they were committed to that. Again, I'm saying because of this understanding that there is good reason for the argument. Let the states stay united. But it doesn't necessarily apply that you will not get a separation, as happened in the case of South Sudan. But the principle of the right to self-determination, I support that. I think we should all of us support that. The application, I think, becomes something else. And Professor Falola, I think I've tried to answer all these 15 questions.
Thank you so much, sir, Mr. President. To members of the audience, I apologize. We can't take another question. The president has been talking for 3 hours, 13 minutes, and we appreciate that a lot. There is a lot of interest, as Mr. President can see. We've generated half the population of South Africa as the audience who have been following this program, which is substantive. We will release the tape immediately. Then 5 minutes after this is over, the tape will become public so that people can view it on Facebook, on YouTube, and other fora. If you have questions, I will forward your questions to the foundation. We have so many questions. We did not enable the chat, but we directed all of you to the registration center to send your question. I will now call two things. After the gratitude, we will go back to our playlist. If you love music, stay along. We'll be donating that playlist to the Mbeki Foundation as part of the memory of this great event. And because we created this playlist for it, I don't know whether the president has been listening to some of this music, mainly from South Africa, from various ages and various artists. It's my pleasure to call on His Excellency, His Royal Highness, King Funkem of Cameroon, to give the vote of thanks. Your Excellency, sir.
Thank you very much.
Professor Falola, terribly sorry.
Yes,
sorry,
sir.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Before that,
yes, sir.
Let me just say, please, I agree entirely, Professor Falola, we just said, to send the foundation all of these questions so we can try and deal with them.
Yes, sir.
But lastly, thanks a lot to you,
yes,
Professor Falola. Thanks for arranging all of this.
Yes,
so that this dialogue and conversation among ourselves, particularly as Africans here and in the diaspora, that dialogue must continue. But thanks a lot for what you've done, what you have done,
yes,
to initiate and organize what, in fact, I think is a very important engagement. Thanks a lot.
And greetings from the Olo Foundation. They are here with us. They sent a question on African peer review, and I apologize to the foundation and Our Excellency Ambassador Awolowo Dosunmu that we've run out of time. Thank you. Your Excellency King Funkem, please give the vote of thanks. We can see your head is cut off, sir.
Oh.
Oh, you're wearing your cap. That's good.
Oh, thank you very much, Prof. I'm going to be very brief because of all the time we've taken of the president's availability. I want to begin this word of gratitude on behalf of the millions of the participants who have watched our great president over the last 3 hours from all over the world. A renewed, on behalf of all this, a renewed happy birthday, Mr. President. We thank you for your availability. And I think, like a member of the audience, I was so happy for your readiness to not to address just some questions, but all the questions that came to you. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful example. Thank you very much. And you said yourself, it would be unfair if I don't answer somebody's question. You are a great humanist. Thank you, Mr. President. And for us in the audience, we think he did address all the 15 questions you got. And from Cameroon myself, I think those who were thinking that the great leader has not been thinking about Cameroon now are reassured that he is engaging. We just hope that he will continue. As we pray to God Almighty to continue to grant the great leader improved health at 80, so he can continue to provide the kind of leadership we all know he has done, not just in South Africa, but across the entire continent. You hear him say he has been everywhere and they are calling on him. We've all heard that. In the same spirit, and like the president pointed out, we laud the leadership of the great Professor Falola in these rich conversations, which bring us the opportunity to come close to leaders like President Mbeki and the knowledge and the experience and all that he has and will continue to give. Thank you, Professor Falola, for your work. Without you, we might not have the opportunity to have these conversations. And I want to not keep you long, tell every participant that the conversations are ongoing. Please, we have seen the quality, like just what President Mbeki provided us this evening, this afternoon, where you are. They come up often. Professor Falola is bringing them to us. Please think of coming back and benefiting the way you have heard, we have all experienced. And to the great audience of today, thank you so very much for your questions, those that were addressed, those to be sent in. Please, thank you. They were great questions. And Professor Falola apologized that all questions could not be put on the table behind the great president, but they will be sent in. So once more, we've had a wonderful opportunity to listen to one of Africa's greatest leaders. We thank you all for being here, and we look forward to having you back in the next conversation. Thank you all very much. And we wish the president a wonderful year and many more years to you, Mr. President. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. So let's listen to music.